Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you back to a continuation of our series Holes in the Narrative that I am doing here with our brother Mel, who's joining us virtually, and we will basically introduce him shortly. And this is really to highlight, as we've demonstrated to you so far in the previous episodes, that the standard Islamic narrative is sketchy at best. There are things that you hear about the teachings of Islam or that the standard Islamic narratives addressed, and yet there are other sources that contradict that, or at least prove it wrong, or prove that whatever the standard Islamic narrative is teaching does not really jive well with findings. For instance, today we are going to talk about the fact that there are some narratives out there stating that Muhammad had a golden idol of himself. Not necessarily he's the one who did it, but there was a golden idol of Muhammad in the Dome of the Rock. And that in and of itself is so damaging because if you know anything about Islam, it's against idols, it's against statues, and so on and so forth. Yet it is clear here that there are some findings that even date later into the Islamic history that contradict those narratives. With that in mind, I want to introduce our brother Mel. Mel, welcome, brother. And thank you so much, as always, for your hard work and labor.
Well, it's great to be back, and I think this is going to be an interesting episode. I'd like to quote from CIRA 34:13, if I may, which might explain a little bit of the thinking behind this. CIRA 34:13, according to one translation I have, and there may be other translations that could be made, but they made for him what he willed of elevated chambers, statues, bowls like reservoirs, and stationary kettles. But what I'm interested in is they made for him what he willed of statues. And maybe that is the justification for what we're talking about today. If we think back to the 8th century, moving forward into the 12th century, Islam was a relatively new religion. Nothing was really set in stone. There were CIRAs written. There weren't too much of a clear idea of what was in and what was out in terms of the religion. So it was quite fluid. And if you look at a lot of the sects that you see nowadays, like the Alawites and so forth, you'll see that you get snapshots of what Islam could have been in different areas back in the early days. And what's interesting is that when Islam expanded into Central Asia, the people who converted to Islam brought with them their old beliefs. So, for example, in Afghanistan, that used to be a Buddhist country. And further east as well, there was large areas that were Buddhist. Of course, you had the Zoroastrians in Iran. And if you think about the Buddhists, they would have had no problem with having statues. They would have a statue of the Buddha, of course. And even the caliphs, and we saw this already in the years 700 up to 750, those caliphs had statues in their palaces. So there wasn't a major problem with having a statue per se. So if we draw a line, a spectrum from the caliphs who were happy with statues to those who were formerly Buddhists who became Muslims, you can see that there is a possibility that at least for a certain length of time, it could have been possible that at least a portion of Muslims might have been okay with having statues of Muhammad. Whether they viewed these statues as idols or not is an open question. But I'm going to be looking at two sources today which suggest that they may have had idols of Muhammad. This is not 100% rock solid. All I'm doing is reporting the sources, and our viewers can make up their own mind whether they think the sources are credible or not. So
thank you. Let's
go to this slide here. Now, there's two sources here, and one source is from a priest, actually, Ralph of Caen, or Caen, if I'm pronouncing it wrong, who's from France. He reports the destruction of an idol of Muhammad found on the Temple Mount in a book he wrote in 1118 about the First Crusade during the period of 1096 to 1195. Just ask you to focus on chapter 129 there. Tancred despoils the temple. So there was a witness account given to Ralph, and he just reports it in his book about the Crusades. And what they found on the Temple Mount is quite incredible. It says that a cast image made from silver sat on the highest throne. It was so heavy that 6 men with strong arms could barely lift it, and 10 barely sufficed to carry it. When Tancred saw this, he said, "Alas, why is this image here which stands on high? What is the purpose of this image with its gems and gold? What is the purpose of this purple cloth? For it was an image of Muhammad, entirely covered with gems, purple cloth, and shining with gold." So that's an incredible report. This really goes against the standard Islamic narrative. Muslims are told that in pre-Islamic times there were idols and those were destroyed. And then from the time of Muhammad onwards, Islam was a religion that was vehemently against having idols. But yet we have that report. I don't know if you want to give your reaction to that.
Yeah,
report.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind right away, I wonder if we should really research at some point, myself, yourself, your team, Jay, the origin of this prohibition, actually. When did it exactly start? Because we're noticing that there is a lot of progressive, basically, adaptation or progressive development when it comes to prohibitions or acceptance of certain things. For instance, what I mean by that is like, the idea that prophets are, inerrant or immune from error. That's a later development. So you wonder if up until this point, there were statues of Muhammad. It appears that people knew even how to depict him, right? You do not make a statue of somebody unless you know from previous statues or from previous images how he might have looked, for instance, or what is the image that was accepted, if you wish. And if it was indeed at the Dome of the Rock, that's even more damaging because that's one of those prominent places for Islam and its worship, and it's clearly Islam tries to connect it to Muhammad in a variety of ways. In chapter 17 of the Quran, for instance, in the fact that Muhammad's ascension to heaven came from that place, and so on and so forth. So you wonder if there is any connections between all of those events.
Yeah, that's true. And I suppose if people are struggling to accept the idea that it's possible that they could have made statues of Muhammad, just bear in mind that a significant number of people, as I mentioned at the outset, were from Central Asia. Many of them were former Buddhists, so they wouldn't have had any problem. And also there's actual pictures of Muhammad drawn by Muslims from that time as well. So at least that confirms the idea that they were not against the idea of creating images of Muhammad. It's not really that much of a jump from images to statues, because essentially you're only going from a 2-dimensional image to a 3-dimensional image. Unfortunately, my slides have disappeared, so maybe if the team can there we go, thank you. So this second source is from the Song of Roland, which is a French poem that was begun in 1040 with additions and alterations made up until about 1115. So it's roughly contemporary with this other report. And it refers to a guy called Marsili, whose name is mentioned about 5 lines down there. He is the Muslim leader of the Saracens stationed in Spain. And it says that he calls them together, the barons of Spain, the counts, the viscounts, the dukes, etc. 400,000 he puts in battle array in 3 days. Then he has tambours sounded throughout Saragossa. He hoists Muhammad up to the highest tower. There is not a heathen who does not pray to him and adore him. So what is suggested there is that he is hoisting a statue of Muhammad, and the people there are praying to him and adoring him. This would, I would suggest, confirm the other report of the practice of having statues of Muhammad.
Right.
This
right.
this being in Spain. So it is really damaging. It would suggest that the Muslims, at least in those centuries, were comfortable with it. And what's interesting is that the Crusaders brought these stories back and told them widely and made a mockery of Islam on the basis of these stories. And you can imagine how there would have been an attempt to rewrite the narrative and hide these stories if they were true. So what you find is in later centuries, you don't get these stories of reoccurring of statues of Muhammad. So it seems to be, if there's any veracity in these stories, that they were true for a while and then the things changed in a later period.
That's correct.
Now, if we look,
and it's an excellent point. Yeah, it's an excellent point that you bring up, that it confirms at least the existence of such thing, and also it shows that Islam does not transform ideologies and worldviews. It's just an added-on thing. I mean, it seemed like the people in these areas were used to statues and idols, and all they're doing now is just incorporating Muhammad as part of those.
Exactly. Now, the question is was this just propaganda? There's a question of, were the Crusaders ignorant of what Muslims believed? These are the common challenges to that. We could possibly or probably dismiss these reports as propaganda or even fabricated as a result of ignorance. But we should not discount the fact that Spain had been occupied by the Moors and the Spanish had close contact with Muslims. So such reports could easily have been dismissed if they didn't have some germ of truth to them. So the fact that these stories are going around and they're not being contradicted by the Muslims living in Spain would suggest that there might have been something there. But unfortunately, they destroyed that statue, which would have been, the primary evidence for that golden idol if it existed. So all we have are these reports. We should also note that the specificity of the report as to the weight, appearance, and size of the idol is worth noting, and that would suggest that if a story is being made up, why were they so specific about the weight and how many people it took to carry it and so on? It would suggest that there's some truth to it. We should also note that increasing numbers of Muslims came from parts of Central and Eastern Asia who would have little objection to creating idols due to the influence of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a further confirmation, which is this painting here. This is actually painted by Muslims, and it comes from the 14th century. It's from a book called the Miraj Nama, or the Book of Ascension.
Right.
And what's interesting, as you can see, is you have an image of Muhammad supposedly talking to Abraham and the other prophets. And you can see that it's depicting him inside the Dome of the Rock. And some people have said, well, actually what's happening is this is a human image of Muhammad being depicted. But if you look at the size of Muhammad, and he's not in the foreground, but he's in the background, and you look at the size of the people in the foreground, what's depicted here is something other than a human form of Muhammad. I think it's fair to say that this would fit very nicely with the story of the idol, especially as you can see in its description, the idol was covered with James' purple cloth and shining with gold. And what do you have in the picture but exactly that purple cloth?
Right.
So there, this is not conclusive by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an interesting contradiction of the standard Islamic narrative, once again showing that the standard Islamic narrative is sketchy.
And you can see angelic being next to him. So, who in the world in a human form would have angelic beings? Only Christ, we find out that he has angelic beings who came to serve him. And yet you can see those angelic beings to the left of the photo. And also, like you said, look at the size of Muhammad. He has a halo around his head and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And you don't find the halos that I can see, at least, around the head of anyone else there. So
correct.
They're clearly making a distinction. Now, if you divinize someone, if you make someone into essentially a god by having like a halo, and you're not depicting anyone else in that manner, that suggests that at some level or other you're making an idol of the figure. So I would suggest that there's evidence as I've depicted, 2 Christian sources and 1 Muslim source, and in the next episode we're going to see that in the practice of funerals, there is some evidence that Muhammad was treated like a god, someone that you could pray to on your behalf, to get your prayers answered before Allah. So that would fit in with this idea of Muhammad being treated as an idol.
Right.
So my verdict, really, looking at all of the evidence, is that considering we have actual images made of Muhammad from that time, it is well within the bounds of possibility that statues could have been made of him too, especially as we have statues of the caliphs in existence. It is, in my view, a credible, if surprising, report.
That's right. So. Wonderful, brother. And what would be the next one that we're going to talk about?
The next one we're looking at is the idea of the mausoleums in early Islam and how that contradicts the standard Islamic narrative.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, everyone. You've been watching our 1 episodes of our series known as, or we called it, the Holes in the Narrative, and the fact that the standard Islamic narrative is sketchy. And we've been building upon one point after the other to show contradictions between the narrative and findings, narrative and findings. And here we're talking about the idea that even though Islam denies or rejects the idea that Muhammad will have a statue after him or could be worshipped, we're finding evidence here that there are sources that are depicting him as an idol that was being elevated, exalted, or even worshipped based on some of the images that we showed you here. Thank you, brother, as always. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Until we meet again in the next episode, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, CIRA International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.